So this is pretty much the premise of this thing is that I've got a site which has an entire spreadsheet worth of content that they're using to manage their website for listings, and I'm converting it onto a pod system. Now, if you're familiar with pods, this isn't exactly an introductory thing, but this has to do with importing junk from a spreadsheet into pods. And there's a lot of subtlety to it. I mean, I'll show you this spreadsheet real quick. We'll take a look at it. And what you're going to notice right off the bat with this thing is it's pretty typical. It's got your normal columns. Boy, here we are in data. I'm more of a fan of Google Docs myself, but this is just what's on the computer right now. This is kind of a mess to look at, but essentially these are our column headings here. The name, listing, categories. So what I want to do is programmatically go through each of these listings and create a pod for each one. It sounds straightforward, but with pods it's a little weird. Their import system from a spreadsheet isn't exactly on point. So what I'm doing is essentially it's kind of like I'm iterating through it using PHP to go right through the CSV file. And what I did over here is I wrote a quick little class to import a few things. So we're at the stage in the game where I've already got, these are my listings. That was an entire page of listings. There's also listing categories, which I've already made pods for, and subcategories, which are made pod for using the same technique. So to show you from scratch, I'm basically going to wipe out these listings real quick. And what I like to do is kind of keep one of these MySQL screens open, and I continuously, what I like to call freeze the database at points that are right at the point where I'm starting to work. So this database, I'm going to come in here and dump all the data out of WordPress, just like that, ghost. And I'm going to reload it, just like that. And this is going to load at a point that I've decided was good. And this is the point where this stuff is all blank. See, no listings. But I've still got my categories in place, I've still got my subcategories in place, and I've got my pods in place. And I suggest doing this because trying to remove things from pods using like delete all items doesn't exactly work 100% in these cases. So it's good to have a clean install. Alright, so with the clean install in place, what I'm going to accomplish here is importing my listings. Nothing in this system. So this page right here is just a quick and dirty little template page that I made in WordPress. It's associated with a page called Y, and it's using page-y as the template. I wrote a class right into this thing here. It's called pods pop. And basically it's got a parser that reads in the CSV file, and then it goes through, and you can see down here is basically the controller. This is where it adds the categories. We've done that. Subcategories, done that. And those are important because these pods are dependent on those. Down here, this is the add listing function. Now, something to note is I've made it so you can drop in a number here. Like this essentially says start at listing 555. Because as you're going to see, this thing will time out on most servers. I'm running it locally, so I do have the options to come in here and drop in some directives like say, all right, never time out and use 512 megabytes of memory. That usually gets it done, but I'm going to be making this thing live on GoDaddy, and there's no way this thing is going to be able to run, never mind be able to kind of come in here and set these resources. I'm going to try, but GoDaddy's going to limit it. So essentially, that's what this is for. So let's just give it a run, and we're going to do this by default with none of these limitations so you can see what happens here. I'm going to just set it to run, so by just straight up running this page, it's going to say add listings. It's going to pull in that whole spreadsheet we looked at, and it's going to start doing the thing, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So let's kick it off and get it running, because it'll take a minute, and this thing will spin. So what's going on here is it's basically saying, okay, now that it's read in all the data into from the spreadsheet into an array, it's going to take that, and basically the first line here says, oh, if this thing says start at 500 or start at some arbitrary number, cut the array and start there. That's going to come in handy when this thing goes on GoDaddy, because you can already see this thing's going to be limited based on these errors. Coming right down here, this is specific for my use case. All these fields correspond to the pod fields. This took me a little bit to figure out, but if you want to do things like essentially programmatically create pods, and that's what we're doing here, we're using the pods API to do this, there's a few little tricks, and it's mostly filling out the correct fields. Now we'll look at the listings pod, and this is what we're auto-generating as listing pods. And if you look at the managed fields, you'll be able to see that these kind of correspond. So for example, phone underscore number corresponds to phone underscore number. So as we iterate through each line of that spreadsheet as an array, we're saying, all right, stick the phone number in here, stick the email in here into an array called fields. Essentially, when you go to programmatically create a pod, you hand it an array of fields as the configuration data. And then this line right here says pods, the type of pod, which in this case is a listing. The name for that you can find right over here. Oh, I'm sorry, actually you can't find it here. Go to edit pods. You can find it here under name. That's the programmatic name for the pod you're going to access. So we're saying, okay, pods, create a listing, and then add it into the pods database and give it the attributes of this field. And this field corresponds to these guys right here. A couple things to note: if you're programmatically creating pods, you want to set the status of it to publish so it goes live. It'll start by draft by default. That's what you want, great. Also, the name corresponds to the actual, like, the post title name of the pod. And then content is the description of the pod. And these things correspond to the WP table. Let's have a look, because in this particular case, they're all being stored as WP posts. And you can see over here, let's look at post name, for example. See how it says post name? See how the post is dropped off of it? You don't actually call post underscore name to create these pods. You just straight up call name. And the same thing is the case when you go to something like status. See post status, we're dropping the post prefix. And the same thing for content. Now that drove me a little crazy to figure out. You're just straight up dropping these things. You're just going to call it content. So that'll programmatically create those fields. So that's essentially what we're doing here. We're taking the database, we're taking the spreadsheet, we're converting it into an array, and then we're going to iterate over the array to fill out a fields array, which is this bad boy right here. And that's going to give the details to pods that it needs to create a pod of that listing type. There's a lot going on there. We're going to get into what these do in just a second. There's a little bit of intelligence there. Now this is saying existing pod for body mass index calculator. Now the problem is if pod sees a duplicate, it's going to immediately stop the whole import process. So you want to make sure your data is pretty clean and you're not trying to import over stuff. So in this case, let's look at our pods. And you can see it was successfully did 219 before it stopped when it found that duplicate. We'll go right to page 11. And it was complaining about a body mass calculator thingy. Let's search for it. And you can see it's right here. And if we look at the ID, this is 213. This entire thing stopped at 219. So basically we can come down here, and instead of having to dump everything out or clean it up, we'll just straight up skip to the next one. You know, this is kind of hacky, but this is how you can get it done. So if it stopped over here at 219, we're going to pop in 220, 221 actually. But we'll go 220 and run it just to see if it says the same thing. It may not. Looks like it's going to be good. Alright, so it continues on like this. And this is how you can systematically populate all these pods when you're using a very limited shared resource like, I don't know, GoDaddy, for example, is where this is ultimately going to end up. If you're doing this yourself and you're going to deploy like a proper developer should, if you're in that position, by all means set these things up the way they are. Crank them out. You can let the whole thing just run and go get a cup of coffee. That's what I suggest. But for the sake of demonstration, we'll show you the problems that occur. And the last little bit I want to talk about here is that these particular listings, I want to show you they have a relationship to listing category and listing subcategory. So we'll just look at this one listing, for example, and if you scroll down, you can see listing category. Now, my import is automatically solving for these, which is very nice. It's setting up the listing category and subcategory, and it's doing that by doing a little bit of querying. See, this thing just timed out. So you come in here, you look at your list. Oh, we're up to 445. Beautiful. So let's go 446, save it, and we'll kickstart it again. So that continues to run. And the point I'm getting at with the listing categories, to associate these things correctly, you got to do a little bit of lookup magic. So down here, where it says CID, what I'm solving for is the category ID, and I'm doing that by taking the title. I'm taking the title of the row, and I'm saying, okay, try to find it. I'm sorry, not the title of the row. Let me pull up the spreadsheet to really illustrate this thing real quick. And we'll look at it through numbers. I should really just upload this to Google Docs. It would be much cleaner. And that's primarily where I work with it. Or download OpenOffice for that matter. Alright, so here's the deal. When it iterates over a single row, and it goes to figure out what category it belongs to, I've named it listing category assigned. So it'll look at this row, and it'll say, okay, arts, activities, and entertainment. Arts, activities, and entertainment is already created as a category in the system, right here. And as such, it has its own ID. And if we look up top, we can see it's an ID of 2. In order for pods to associate correctly, it has to know that ID. So to get that, what we're doing is, we're going to look at the data set. We're going to take this right here, copy that, and to solve for it, we're going to get term by ID. We're going to use the slug. And to get the slug for that, you pass it through sanitized title. The sanitized title is essentially a routine in WordPress that's going to pull out all the ampersands, it's going to pull out the commas, it's going to put dashes in, it's going to lowercase everything, it's going to make it nice. It's essentially how slugs are built. So given that title, and given that you can look up term IDs by slugs, we don't have the 2 pieces of information in order to look up the listing category. And listing category is essentially the name of the taxonomy assigned to that particular pod, as seen here. So it's saying, all right, we've got this slug we've created here. We're telling it to look for the slug, and we want the listing category. And it says if it does find something, it's going to return an array. And inside of that array, we want to isolate the term ID. And that's the magic number that we looked at earlier. That's the 2 right there. You know, it's that number. So if it does find it, it says, great, append it to the fields array as a listing category assigned. And that number right there is associated back at our listing pod. Right here, listing category assigned. So that's how you solve for it. These pod drop-down menus are numeric in the background. It says a big title on it, but the actual value is the term ID. And the same thing essentially for the subcategory ID. We're taking the database field. In this case, we're going with listing category. And we'll make that a little bigger. Listing category assigned is activities. So we take activities. We're essentially passing activities right into the sanitizer to get the slug for it. And then we're saying, all right, WordPress, get the term ID using the slug. This is the slug search, that's the needle. And then do this search in the listing subcategory. And the listing subcategory corresponds to the appropriate pod right here. Listing subcategory. So it'll search through, it'll try to find a match, and again, if it finds a match, take that array, isolate the term ID, and pass it into the fields array. So it appends those 2 if it has it. Not every listing has one. So with all those in place, it takes this nice fields array, it passes it down here into the pods constructor, pods listing, pods object, call the method add fields, and then it adds the field. Here's our little node data thing continuing to spin. We'll go back to listings one more time. We'll take a look. 655. Now, we got a lot to go. This thing's like 1,600, so I'm not going to do them all now. But essentially, this is the process if you got to do it on a restricted resource environment, and you don't have a lot of options. Like in this particular case, I'm handed the project, so to speak, and I just got to do what I can. I don't have like the proper like local development to work off of, like you know, the perfect world scenario. It just ain't the case. It's the real world, baby. We make do. So you pop in 655, you run the thing, and then it's going to go through as long as it can again. And that's essentially how this import process works. This would be a lot more straightforward if I didn't associate categories and subcategories. That's why it's a little bit dicey. But essentially the workflow, if you break it right down, it's all about this right here. It's about that line, and it's about this configuration right here to systematically create pods. Now, something to note, and this might drive you a little nuts, is that you got to be within essentially the WordPress ecosystem in order to access this pod's object. It's instantiated somewhere in the WordPress muck. I don't know exactly where. You can't just straight call that. So this is why I baked it into a page, just because it was quick and easy. You could use a plugin or anything that's like, you know, down with the WordPress system. But essentially, you pass it, you could do just this to create a new pod. I mean, that's it. You give it a field config, and if we want it to be real, just, you know, array, name, and then you pass it a value whenever you want to call your new pod. I mean, this is a programmatic process, so you're going to pass it more, you know, you're going to pass it in an array loop or something to create these suckers, but essentially this is how you can programmatically create pods. That's all there is to it, is this line right here. You call pods, you call the type of pod you want to create, add, and then pass in a configuration array to it with the values you want. And all these values, just really reiterate this one more time, are associated to your pod, whatever you created for your pod values. In this case, listings. I could be sending in values for anything under this name column. URLs, phone numbers. That's really messed up. Email-y, something. That's just bootleg. Anyway, moving right along. This is just a dev site, so it ain't the end of the world. And that's how this is pretty much done programmatically. Good solution if you get to do crazy imports like I have to do. Took me a while to figure out this process. I originally went the MySQL route. I was trying to look at the way pods would put in all the MySQL stuff. By watching basically the history of MySQL, you can get that if you trace things within the MySQL stack. Over in, go to map real quick. Map, oops, cd app, map. And then in here, if you go into the bin file, you modify, let's see, I think it's start mysql.sh. In this line right here, this is passing the log constructors to it, or log directives to it. MySQL log all queries. Oof, I hate those documentations. This is what you want right here. That. And you pass that in, and then you give it a name. It's going to show up here under the logs folder. Now, one thing to know, watch this one. This is one I was using earlier. These files get gigantic fast, so keep an eye on it, or use a cron. Actually, this one's clean. Or use cron to clean it up occasionally, because it's going to load everything, and I mean everything. Inserts, queries, whatever. But it's very insightful to see what's going on, so you can see exactly what pods is doing. But in this case, it's easier to use the pods API instead of trying to hack it through MySQL, because there's a lot of relationship stuff going on that you just it's a pain to reproduce without just using the API. So hopefully this is helpful. If you need the code, hit me up. And yeah, good luck using pods and important stuff.